people love the Pocahontas story.
She's one of the most famous Indians in the world, in the United States. Everybody has heard her name at some point.
We don't have any kings and queens, but we do have an Indian princess. But there are many things we know and many more things that we don't know.
I think we tend to want to make our heroes who we want them to be, and so sometimes myth weaves in there, our own perceptions kind of weave into the story.
I have asked the Great Spirit to help us find a way so that we can all peacefully live together.
Over 400 years, I think the history has gotten a bit twisted and manipulated.
Only the woman he loved would save him.
She has become a commodified product.
Liquid Prell's rich lather lets you become Pocahontas.
She is literally sold, and money is made off of her.
We see the Disney version, now let's talk about the real Pocahontas.
The way to encounter the trickiness of her story is to say, we will embrace the mystery of Pocahontas.
Although more than 400 years have passed since she first stepped into history, Pocahontas continues to capture the imagination of people everywhere. Her life and legend have been appropriated by many, but Central and Tidewater, Virginia can correctly claim her as their own. In Henrico, her name and likeness are so familiar that they've become part of the official landscape, appearing on roads, a school, and the county seal, among other places. Pocahontas was probably born around 1595. Not much is known about her mother, though historians suggest she might have died during childbirth. Her father, however, was Seneca, the powerful chief Powhatan. He commanded an area stretching from what we know today as the James River north to the Potomac that included a population of approximately 25,000 people and more than 30 tribes. The capital of his chiefdom, and the possible birthplace of Pocahontas, was Werowocomoco, located on the York River in what is now Gloucester County. Powhatan had many children, but by all accounts, Pocahontas was a favorite. Her given names were Amanute and Matoaka, though even as a young girl, she was known by her nickname, which meant playful, joyous one.
I think Pocahontas was just a very happy child. I think she just loved to play, and I think she had a sense of humor. And I think her father probably enjoyed her sense of humor. And I think also she could sometimes maybe get a little bit of mischief. So I could see where she was just a fun-loving person. And I think her father really enjoyed her, probably having her around. He probably got many a smile out of Pocahontas.
The first record of Pocahontas comes from accounts written by Jamestown colonists. England's first permanent settlement in North America had been established in May 1607 as a commercial venture by the Virginia Company of London. Jamestown settlers led a precarious existence, but their spirits were lifted whenever a remarkable native girl visited their outpost as part of trade envoys from Powhatan. Pocahontas charmed the English with her playfulness and impressed them with her character and poise. Captain John Smith wrote that her feature, countenance, and proportion much exceedeth any of the rest of Powhatan's people for wit and spirit, the only nonpareil of his country.
She first appears here that we know of in 1608. It appears as if she's sent as an ambassador by her father. And at the same time, there seems to be some type of draw that she has to these people. There must be something about the English that just intrigues her so much. She wants to learn more about them.
The settlement at Jamestown and satellite settlements were living on the sort of knife edge of existence at all times. There was nothing settled about their fate whatsoever. It was, I think, extremely dire.
When the colonists arrived, it took them too long to get here. They ate up the provisions. They were in a food deficit immediately. The starving time was all the time, basically.
Supplies of food provided by the Powhatan Indians were essential to the settlers at Jamestown.
We kind of have to remove her specifically from the forefront and say her people were responsible for saving the colony. And the decisions, of course, probably were made by her father.
She's being taught, being raised by her father essentially, to be an ambassador to him. And if that means she has to travel in his name, she has to do that. She has to be taught that, and she has to be entrusted to that. If she's going to be married off by her father, then she's going to be married off by her father to another tribe, then she's going to do that as well. So far as Pocahontas, through probably the historical prism, she's probably growing up a lot faster than I think modern day America is going to give her credit for.
If Pocahontas' role in supplying the English settlers has been exaggerated or misunderstood, that may suggest something more about the mindset and perception of the English themselves, and the way history can be replaced by legend and myth over time.
I think Pocahontas' story, it really captures especially the 19th century mind. If you think about the Romantic movement in Europe and in American art and literature, Pocahontas plays a perfect role as kind of a child of nature, this sort of natural being to whom so many romantics want to return. They want that state of idealized naturalism. She's depicted constantly with this, in some cases, very Europeanized look to her, in some cases, almost Middle Eastern look to her.
Although there are many depictions of her, only one was created from her actual appearance, an engraving commissioned by the Virginia Company when Pocahontas visited England in 1616. Virginia portrait artist Mary Ellen Howe spent 6 years researching the engraving in an effort to shed new light on the authentic Pocahontas.
Most artists have egos, and they want to do it their way. The only one done from life was the engraving, and that was by Van de Pass. And what I did was to copy that, and on the top of that engraving, not changing 1 inch, is the oil paint. I looked for the truth, and that's what I wanted to show in her, what she really looked like, how lovely she was. She wasn't a raving beauty. She was a handsome woman, and I think the portrait portrays that, and her inner peace and inner dignity. The other pictures are pure fantasy.
Pocahontas was a Pamunkey individual, and we like to understand her life within a Powhatan perspective, an indigenous perspective. A lot of the times when her image is brought up in the contemporary world, her indigenous identity is kind of lost in that. If you really want to understand her from a Powhatan perspective, the term princess does not apply.
I think it goes back to this notion of what was, current in the 19th century as the world is industrializing and moving towards increased urbanism, that you look back and try to find in the past this great paragon of natural virtue. She becomes that perfect natural being, and I think it's really in that time period where you start to see the idealization and the great romanticization of Pocahontas.
Her legacy is something that has been appropriated by the non-native society, and unfortunately our claim and our relationship to her as a Pamunkey woman, as a Pamunkey person, has been lost in that, I feel like, especially over the past 100 years. So the Pamunkey community has used Pocahontas, her image and her legacy, as a way to really make that connection to the past and to represent and show other folks that are not native in the area that the Pamunkey people are still here. Especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, you had this troupe of performers called the Pamunkey Players that included my great-great-grandfather, George Major Cook, who was one of the lead players in those productions. They would relay and literally play out the story of John Smith and Pocahontas.
History and tradition furnishes conclusive proof that we are the lineal descendants of the original Pamunkey, the most formidable tribe of that great world-once Powhatan Confederacy, who met the first Virginia colonists in America. We boast of the fact that we are the lineal descendants of the original actors of that world-renowned drama. The captive Captain John Smith by O.P. Canoe, trial by King Powhatan, and rescue by Little Snow Feather, better known as Pocahontas.
That story, which took place in December 1607, has long been ingrained in the popular understanding of Pocahontas. It has also been the subject of countless interpretations and portrayals. Smith described the event some 17 years later in his General History of Virginia.
As his publications are starting to get traction in England, he's going to reinvent himself a little bit through his writings to where Pocahontas is going to save his life. You know, that's where it starts. And of course, most people, when they picture a woman saving a man's life, it's this love and adoration. Whereas the story is, rent with holes.
There are a lot of different theories about what that event was. Did it happen? Did it take place? Was it real? Did John Smith make it up? In his travels throughout Europe, and then also what would become Eastern Europe, he has similar stories about young women saving his life. So a lot of people speculate that he's just made the entire thing up. The other theory is that what was happening to him in a Powhatan, cultural perspective was an adoption ceremony, which makes sense.
Very few things that he wrote have ever been proven completely false. He was a great observer of things, had a real eye for detail, and he could very well have been called out on errors. And so I don't think we should just pretend he fabricated things out of whole cloth. How he interpreted them, obviously is another story.
The crescendo of the adoption event, or whatever you want to call it, was when he was put in the presence of all of these women, and as the singing, the dancing, the movement is really coming to a head, his head is literally placed onto a bed of stones, and when he believes that his life is about to end because somebody is holding a club over his head and he thinks his skull is about to be bashed in, Pocahontas, as he relays, lays herself over him to save his life. Her role in that was the symbolic role of the young Powhatan woman making that call and that decision.
He really didn't have much motive to lie about the incident, because he wasn't suggesting, well, it was my bravery or my, great feats of physical strength or something that got me out of this situation. It was the efforts of this young girl, which that doesn't really do much for him. If anything, he was kind of in this helpless position and was saved by a child, if you will.
There's several examples of Seneca and the English both trying to make each other subservient to the other through their own rituals and symbolism that, again, never quite plays out as either side would expect or want.
Powhatan is going to put his daughter as a chaperone to Smith. That will develop into this ongoing friendship between the two. At least once we think that she is going to warn Smith of an attack. So there's these various things that, there's a friendship and there's a cordiality between the two, but there's not a romance.
The initial period of goodwill between the English settlers and Powhatan Indians, fostered by the chief's gifts of food and the diplomatic charm of Pocahontas, did not last. By 1609, Powhatan had ended most trade with the settlers, having grown tired of their demands for food, and perhaps dismayed by their refusal to become part of his chiefdom. Pocahontas was forced to curtail her frequent visits to Jamestown, a troubling sign for the English, who recognized her importance to Powhatan and saw her as a symbol of peace. Later that year, John Smith was injured in a gunpowder accident and was forced to return to England. Pocahontas was told that her friend had died. Cut off from her connection with the English, she temporarily disappears from view. In the meantime, relations between the settlers and Indians continued to deteriorate.
There was, unfortunately, a lot of conflict right off the bat when the English arrived in 1607, and a lot of that has to do with just conflict over resources and also encroachment on Powhatan lands as well, and misunderstandings. These are two very different cultures from very different worldviews, so obviously a conflict is going to ensue.
Pocahontas resumed her life as the favorite daughter of a powerful chief. In 1610, now a young woman at age 15, she is believed to have married a Potawatomi warrior named Cocoam and moved north to live in the Potomac region.
Unfortunately, there just isn't a lot in terms of explaining or documenting what was happening to her life during that time period, but she was being raised as a Powhatan woman within a very interesting context of this first decade of sustained colonial interaction.
She next appears in English accounts in 1613, when Captain Samuel Argall sailed up the Potomac on a trade mission. Argall learned of her presence in a village nearby and sensed an opportunity.
He is essentially going to go and find her there and bring her back to the governor at Jamestown and present Governor Gates at the time with a captive in which Governor Gates can use to manipulate Powhatan. So Argall is going to go do that, and he's going to do not the old-fashioned kidnapping that we picture, which is throw the blanket over someone's head and put him in the van and speed off. He's going to basically ask the leader of the Potomac, Japazoos, to convince Pocahontas to have this dinner on board Argall's ship. If you think about it, Pocahontas has always had a good relationship with the English, so not that hard to get her on board the ship. Once there, big meal happens, she gets a little tired, they offer the gunner's room to her, she falls asleep, and eventually Argall's going to sail away with her, and she's going to wind up at Jamestown. Now you're left with the big question, what do you do with her? Well, we know what they did. They offer her back to her father.
She's brought to Jamestown after she's kidnapped. We know she's here. And then the question is, well, how long was she here? There are two documents that you can rely on. The most reliable, I think, is Ralph Hammer, and he indicates that word was sent to her father that she's captive. They're expecting a ransom to be paid, and he says they don't hear from him for 3 months. So if she arrives in April, that puts her here at least to June and July, at which case we start to hear nothing more about her. There's this gap from roughly June, July 1613 to March 1st of 1614. The ransom that he did send, the English didn't feel it was enough, so unfortunately she was continued to be held as a captive here at Jamestown. There's an inference built into this that she was taken to Henricus because of Dale and Whitaker's association with that location. And I cannot sit here today and say, I know for 100% positive sure that she was here that entire time, but that's an active combat zone at the time. They're in the midst of a war. Dale's telling us about casualties being sustained up there during this war.
In 1613, you are on the westernmost frontier of what was then England. It's more of a military outpost than it is anything else. Everything's fortified. Everything is designed to defend. The garrisons are under martial law, so everything is run by soldiers. Everybody is armed. You have essentially Reverend Alexander Whitaker, who is a hardline, for lack of the newer term, Puritan. He was more of what they called a precise man of the Church of England. So what you have is an absolutely iron fist of Sir Thomas Dale here. He's the one that is the, we'll call it for lack of a better term, adopted father now of Pocahontas. He's also in charge of security for the colony, which means all prisoners are under his care. So then you're left with a question of, well, where's he going to put her?
Well, if you think about Pocahontas being essentially a ward of Sir Thomas Dale, it might make some real sense that if he was spending time both in Henricus and in Jamestown, that she would have been part of the party that accompanied him to either spot. But we don't know for sure. And it also is complicated by the fact that, of course, she's a captive and she is a political hostage in many ways. So would there have been some advantages to having her in either place, depending on what the circumstances were and what negotiation or conflict might have looked like at that time? There might have been.
We're looking at into April 1613. Governor Gates and Dale are going to come up with this mutual decision, apparently, to allow Powhatan some time to, answer back to the demands, to finish the deal. He doesn't do that. Well, he offers to give back most of the stuff the English asked for, including the prisoners that he had, but for some reason, he doesn't give back everything they want. Now, the English will say it is that. He didn't give us all those things. And so now you're left with, well, what do? Do we let him just kind of walk away from the deal that we put upon him, or do we keep his daughter? Well, the English are going to keep his daughter.
She was very much a pawn, and she did have as her captors people who assumed that that meant that they had more or less complete control over her, certainly her freedom, her ability to practice her own religion, speak her own language. and make decisions for herself.
In her captivity, she was able to absorb a foreign culture. She was able to learn the language, the customs, and to absorb all of that into her personality.
She was doing her due diligence, and it wasn't about this emotional issue of like, my daddy forgot about me. Politics were definitely involved.
They say that Pocahontas would have gone back to her father if he had just given back some more of those tools, some more of those muskets. There's now a 7 to 8 month, who knows where she's at, where's Waldo with Pocahontas game. There's no writings that come out of Virginia for 7 months that will illuminate what's going on.
I don't think it satisfies a lot of people, but an awful lot of history does fall in that gray area, especially early history. I mean, you think about colonists in early Virginia, they were worried about survival, they were worried about where their next meal was going to come from, whether they were going to be engaged in warfare, whether the colony was going to be resupplied. So many things that you think, well, why would anyone have sat down and written it down, except maybe years down the road?
With negotiations at a stalemate, Dale attempted to force Powhatan's hand. He put together a military expedition of 150 men, and bringing along his prize hostage, set off to confront the chief.
The governor at the time, Thomas Gates, is going back to England, which means Sir Thomas Dale will now become the acting governor of the colony. And Dale has taken it upon himself to say, okay, I'm going to bring this war to a conclusion, one way or the other. We're going to go up to the Pamunkey, York River today. We're going to exchange her for all the tools, the swords, the weapons, the men, and some corn. We're going to exchange her, and if her father agrees to this, we'll become friends. If not, as he says, I'm going to burn all.
On the way, Dale received a lengthy letter from colonist John Rolfe. In it, the devout Rolfe painstakingly described his love for Pocahontas.
As far as John Rolfe's concerned, again, like the rest of the people here, a little bit of an enigma. He had to ask for permission to marry Pocahontas from Dale. So, okay, if Rolfe wants to marry her, what does he have to say? Well, he has to say that he's a sinner. He has to say that he's no good. He has to, kind of put himself down a little bit and understand that he has his weaknesses.
And throughout this long epistle, he's always writing that she's an unbelieving creature. We need to convert her. She has to turn to Christianity. I'm the one who's going to help do this, And so all these indications in this letter are telling us very clearly she has yet to convert. And this is in March of 1614.
Rolfe gives us the impression that, well, geez, I've met her and I think I need to marry her for the greater good of the community and the king and God, and everybody will be well off from me marrying her. Then he ultimately admits at the very end that he does love her, that she is a very special personality, and she is brave, she is intelligent, he has these compliments. So does Dale approve of it? And that's the big question. And Dale apparently does.
Before they could be married, Pocahontas would have to study the Anglican Church and adopt the Christian faith. She also would learn what was expected of an English woman.
The religious leadership coming here is under that pressure to get naturals, as they call them, to convert to the Church of England. So if you are Pocahontas and you are being asked to convert to Christianity, to the Church of England, and to become an English woman, well, how long does it take for her to even get the language right? Religiously, she's not going to understand what the English are trying to tell her as far as what God is and where God is to be found. So she now has to learn that language. But more than that, she has to learn how to wear the clothes. She has to change her diet. She has to change what she drinks. She has to change her toilet. She has to change every aspect of her culture now has to be different. So even intellectually, if she understood that she's exchanging culture to become into a new tribe, so to speak, that would be one thing. But it's all of the physical and emotional manifestations that we can't answer, that we can only speculate at.
Native people were very strategic in the ways in which they chose to adopt certain materials, ways of life, ways of thinking, and Pocahontas, I feel like, would be no different.
If you think about Pocahontas, even as high up as an education she had amongst the Powhatan world to make decisions, she probably struggled. I mean, if you have Sir Thomas Dale constantly putting pressure on you, it's a lot, and she had that. So what kind of emotional and political and spiritual maturity did she have? We'll never know. But one can only speculate that she was probably stronger than what most people give her credit for.
Her marriage to him was a political alliance, which was common in English and Powhatan society at the time. It wasn't necessarily, I don't believe, personally forced upon her by the English or necessarily even by her father or Powhatan leaders. It was something that she knew would be expected of her and was for the betterment, of her people and of the situation that they had found themselves in.
And so they send word to her father. He accepts the idea of this marriage. And so Dale says, aha, we've got a political coup on our hands here. This marriage is going to end this war in our favor.
Pocahontas and Rolfe were married in Jamestown on April 5, 1614. She was baptized, completing her conversion to Christianity, and took the name Rebecca, meaning mother of two peoples.
Then there's a letter in July from the governor, and the heading says, from Jamestown. He describes the wedding, and he said they were married in the church. The church, not a church, the church. And it has to be the church 68 because the dimensions are described by William Strachey, the clerk. Right in front of that chancel is where, I'll guarantee you, Pocahontas was married. And I think that's a place where you can stand and say, hey, this person that practically everybody in the world has heard the name Pocahontas. They probably don't know what it really stands for or anything, but they heard the word. And that's where it happened, in 1614.
Signifying Powhatan's approval, an uncle and two of her brothers attended the ceremony, in addition to Dale and other prominent members of the Virginia colony. The wedding ushered in a new era of goodwill for the English and Powhatan Indians.
It's 1614. Nobody knows that the colony is going to survive and be the birthplace of what is today now our modern nation. That was not known in 1614. So really engaging the Powhatan people in political alliances, in treaty negotiations, was something that would have been at the top of their list, because in many ways we stood in the way of that.
John Rolfe and Pocahontas together will actually culturally do what in England and in the native world will be a tribal assimilation. They're going to blend two cultures into one. If they have a child, better yet, it's going to seal the deal.
Pocahontas, Rolfe, and their young son Thomas traveled to England in spring 1616 as part of a fundraising mission organized by the Virginia Company. Lady Rebecca Rolfe was a sensation, making an indelible impression on the English while attending balls, plays, and other public events.
When Dale goes back to England, Dale is bringing back a dozen Powhatan Indians. He's bringing back Pocahontas, then Rebecca Rolfe. And he's doing it because he wants to show this romantic image of Virginia now. We're making this movement to bring Virginia to the way of the English, and it starts in small doses.
So it's very much, she is this kind of bird in a gilded cage who is being made very much a symbol of this English colonial dominance.
I think that's the beauty of Pocahontas, though, is that she doesn't lose herself, I don't believe, completely. She's always going to be a Virginia Indian.
The fact that she traveled with basically a Powhatan emissary of her brothers, who were all leaders in their own right, to England speaks volumes. I think that also shows that she wasn't just married to this English man and that was the end of it. She was still seen as a prominent and important Powhatan woman. I mean, she met royalty.
She carried it off and charmed everyone.
By early 1617, the family was set to make the return journey to Virginia.
And I don't think she really wanted to go because she was having a good time in England. She was treated the way she should have been. She was royalty. She was a princess. So did she want to go back to being a colonial housewife? I don't think so.
Pocahontas would not see her homeland again. She became gravely ill as their ship set sail and was taken ashore at Gravesend on the Thames River. She died soon thereafter, likely succumbing to an illness such as pneumonia or tuberculosis, though the exact cause is uncertain. Pocahontas was 22. She was buried March 21st, 1617, at St. George's Church in Gravesend.
A lot of people can say suspect things like, well, you know, by bringing her to England, you would know that she was going to contract something. It was only a matter of time before she got something. Then there's some people out there that say she was poisoned. There's all kinds of thoughts about Pocahontas' death. I don't think she was that sick leading up to her starting to get on board that ship on the way back. I mean, who knows? But the reality is something got her quick.
And I don't think that she was fearful at the time of her death. It has been said and written that some of her last words were, "'Tis enough that the child lives." She had this child to leave behind, and I don't think she was that fearful.
Within a year of her death, Chief Powhatan died as well. The so-called Peace of Pocahontas began to unravel, collapsing completely into bloodshed in 1622. Her death begs the question, had she survived, would the peace have survived with her?
I think it would be interesting to survey what would have existed between Anglo and Native relations had she lived another 50 years.
And I think that also kind of is one of the contributing factors to why she became so famous and has this legacy, because she died young and under mysterious or unknown circumstances and never got to finish her journey.
I think there was this idea that she could be a bridge between the two cultures. And so I think she really was going to play a vital role in the future of the colony of Virginia.
She must have been an extraordinary woman, because look at us. We're still talking about her today. She's still fascinating.